So good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Stoneleigh Foundation, I'd like to thank you for joining us for part 2 of our discussion series of Reimagining Public Systems, Centering Racial Equity to Serve Youth, Family, and Communities. My name is Vincent Reina. I will be your moderator this morning, and I could not be more excited with this wonderful group we have here today. So I'm currently a Stoneleigh Fellow. I'm Associate Professor at Penn and the Faculty Director of Housing Initiative at Penn. Before I turn to our panelists, I'd like to provide some background for today's event. So over the past years, against the backdrop of the COVID-19 pandemic and within the context of nationwide racial justice reckoning, policymakers and the public have begun to debate whether our public systems are really serving youth, families, and communities of color effectively and equitably. Last month, during part 1 of the series, our panel of speakers discussed the ways in which carceral systems, criminal justice, child welfare, and immigration often separate and dismantle families and disproportionately harm communities of color. Today's discussion will focus on 3 additional systems: education, housing, and health, each of which provides basic human rights that should be safeguarded for all. And yet a long history of racist policies, practices, and entrenched institutional decision-making has eroded the accessibility, quality, and cultural appropriateness of the systems and services for youth and families of color. I study housing, and the racist history of housing policy in our country has been at the forefront of national conversations of recent years. Many people are familiar with the concept of redlining, a practice whereby the homeownership loan corporation drew colored maps to signal supposed levels of risks in a market, when in fact those colors were not based on risk at all, but solely based on race and ethnicity. And those maps serve to further ingrain racial segregation and limit access to both homeownership, to wealth creation, and a broad set of public investments across the country for Black and Brown communities. As Amy Hillier at Penn has shown, though, the Hulk maps weren't the start of racial discrimination in our housing market, right? In many ways, they reflected pre-existing practices that were longstanding. They far predated the Hulk maps with who could even own land, who could buy land, who had land taken away from them, all of those things. And in many ways, the Hulk maps were the formalization of the racist housing policies that had persisted well before the 1930s. And despite various pieces of legislation banning discrimination in housing markets, with the Fair Housing Act of 1968 being one of the most significant, discrimination still persists in our housing market, right? As Keeanga Yamahata Taylor shows in her Pulitzer Prize finalist book, Race for Profit, we've entered a point where we're seeing much of predatory inclusion in our housing markets. And so that's not really moving us against many policies in the past, but rather in many ways further ingraining some of these past policies in our cities across the country. So this formalizes in many ways, such as Black households having a 25 percentage point lower homeownership rate, Black households often seeing their homes devalued, on average controlling for all household characteristics, having 48,000 less valuation of their homes itself, which reverberates throughout the ability of households to develop wealth across generations, to build off that wealth, to open businesses, to invest in education, all these broad sets of things. And it also formalizes in a lot of other broader set of ways. The pandemic has only brought this to the forefront, right? We know that COVID-19 has disproportionately affected communities of color. We also know that the impacts of COVID-19 are not new, but in many ways exacerbating existing realities faced by many of these communities. They cross education, they cross health, they cross housing. And in many ways, it highlights the real critical need for us to move past the point of making marginal improvements to policy, but making dramatic improvements to policy. And so that's why I'm excited to be here today, because if we can't reimagine the basic systems and structures that have ingrained a lot of these realities in all of our systems, then when can we? So I'm grateful to be joined today by an inspiring panel of speakers who will unpack for us what reimagined approach to providing these basic rights could look like, so that youth and families of color have opportunity to thrive. With that, I'd like to begin by introducing our panelists. We're joined today by Sharif El-Mekki, the founder and CEO of the Center for Black Educator Development, an organization that is revolutionizing education by dramatically increasing the number of Black educators so that low-income Black and other disenfranchised students can reap the benefits of a quality public education. Dr. Akira Rodriguez, an assistant professor of city and regional planning at the University of Pennsylvania. Her research examines the politics of urban planning and the ways that disenfranchised groups reappropriate their marginalized spaces to gain access and sustain political power. Mike O'Brien, the founder of Humanature, a design strategy firm working with nonprofits, business, local government agencies, and their employees to transform how they understand and support human development, interaction, and performance. And Rashni Stanford, a former Stoneleigh Emerging Leader Fellow and the co-founder of Afrofuturist Mental Health Co-op, Deep Space Mind 215. Following our discussion, we'll have plenty of time for audience Q&A. So please submit your questions throughout the event using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And without further ado, I'll begin by inviting each of our panelists to share their thoughts on an initial question. How the reimagination of public systems is happening in your field and whether it has or has not been formalized. And I'm going to start off with Sharif.
Thank you. Grateful to be here with these panelists as well as with the Stoneleigh community. And so I think in many ways, when we look at the work that we're doing at the Center for Black Educator Development, it really centers around four pillars as we call them: policy, professional learning, pedagogy, and pipeline. Our mission is really to rebuild a national Black teacher pipeline. We've all known the short-term impact of Black teachers on Black students. Short-term, less likely to be disciplined, referred for discipline, expelled, et cetera, higher grades, higher test scores, higher sense of belongingness, better attendance, all of those things, and more likely to see themselves reflected in curriculum. And long-term, we know that up to 39% less likely to drop out if a child a Black student has one Black teacher, just one, and up to 29% more likely to go to college. And so when we look at that and have the understanding of like, what does it take for with all of the interventions that we could count over the past 50 years in education, increasing the success, the retention and recruitment of Black teachers has not been systematized in a way that we would think, and particularly in a way that other interventions that have not shown to have that kind of impact, the amount of money that is garnered, the amount of attention, the amount of research has not been put forth in that. So when we talk about reimagining something in this particular space that has shown over thousands of children that it has a colossal impact, I would say that we've not seen it reimagined. We hear it talked about a lot, but talking about things and doing things are wholly, wholly different. And this is not anything new. While there have been more of a clamor of it lately, we also have to recognize that Caroline LeCount right here in Philadelphia talked about more Black educators in the 1800s. We know in 1967 with the Black student walkout when Rizzo sicked his henchmen on high school students who amongst their ask were more Black teachers. And we see now with the campaign that our youth led and launched on September 9th, hashtag We Need Black Teachers. That was a youth-led campaign of youth that were both in our apprenticeship as well as outside of it. They were also demanding the same thing. So there's a thread from the 1800s with Caroline LeCount and her fiance Octavius Catto, all the way to these young Black youth activists who are interested in education, but also are recognizing that as students, they need more Black teachers, and they do not see a concerted effort to do that. And if they don't see it and they're living it, then there's no way in the world I could say that I see it.
Thank you, Akira. I'd like to welcome you to share some thoughts.
Yeah, just thinking a lot about housing. Certainly there were some transformations during COVID, as you know, Vincent, with the sort of flood of rent relief that was possible, a lot of emergency rental assistance, a lot of eviction moratoria. But unfortunately, as I'm sure everyone on this panel and in the audience knows, we are very much considering ourselves post-pandemic and seeing kind of the rolling back and retrenchment of a lot of those benefits. And I certainly think that particularly in my research around sort of Black women and predominantly predominantly Black communities in urban areas, the sort of hollowing out of the welfare state, particularly as it relates to housing, has only increased housing precarity and vulnerability in ways that are almost unprecedented. We're seeing a lot of combination of forces, whether it's increasing aging of housing, the increasing cost of labor, the decreasing capacity of the state to oversee a lot of the high vulnerabilities as it relates to poor housing conditions and standards and inspections in cities. All of these things kind of literally fall on the backs of Black women and their families in the community. And so I've also been seeing increased transformations in school facilities, particularly as related to COVID. We saw the ability for remote learning. We saw the ability for using schools as centers of distribution, whether it's food, again, benefits as relates to pandemic EBT that was distributed to make up for free breakfast and lunch for low-income students, as well as the distribution of Chromebooks, partnerships with communications companies to provide free Wi-Fi. All of these benefits, again, rolled back immediately at the start of the school year, and again, seeing the impacts of the hollowed out state, whether it's shortages of employees, currently 1,900 vacancies in the school district of Philadelphia. So just an untold amount of stresses, again, falling into single households. So while, again, we did see some momentary transformations of our public systems, we are unfortunately back where we started, and a little bit worse for the wear as a result of the hollowing out of the state.
Thank you, Akira. Mike, can you share some thoughts?
Sure. Yeah. Good morning, everybody. Pleasure to be here, and excited we're having this conversation. And I'm excited to be amongst really such a phenomenal panel and group of doers and thinkers. This question was very interesting for me because I try to put myself in the A sector all the time, and I have this problem 24/7. So I think the way I internalize the question has a lot more to do with like mechanics. So I don't think anyone in mass is really reimagining public systems deeply or well. I think individuals like on the call here are. I think there are associations of individuals that are making groupings and really doing this work. But in mass, the positionality of where the power is to really reimagine and redesign these systems, that's not happening across the board. And I think it's uncomfortable for us to sit in because we want to move there, but you can't get from A to Z without hitting the other letters in between. So I think that's to me like the metaphor, if you will, of where we're at. And I think in that space around mechanics, we have to really deal with how people have been socialized and the fact that human beings are creatures of meaning making, right? And that because we make meaning and ascribe meaning to, I'd argue almost everything, even if you don't intentionally want to, kind of happens. And because we also have to deal with the multi-dimensional inputs that make up human development that are also influencing that meaning-making apparatus, we've got situations where people have to reimagine systems with some foundational ideas about human beings and foundational ideas about groups and how things work, either for those groups or the way these systems work on behalf of these groups. And a lot of that comes from how we've been socialized. So many of us have been socialized to think about Black and poor as being synonymous, right? Many people have been socialized to think about, and you hear it in narratives that are large, that so much work is being taken up by X group, by immigrants, et cetera. And these things have their roots, in history, which we'll, get into a bit later in some more discussion. But I think that before we can get to reimagining, you actually have to understand, well, what is it that has created the confluence of issues and factors that we're facing that are challenging the well-being of youth and families across the region, across the country, et cetera. And that's the kind of conversation I find that in the reimagining space, a lot of people are reticent to have, don't know how to have, get scared by, get nervous by, because, and here, I was 25, as an example, I was 25 when I read Where Do We Go From Here by Martin Luther King Jr., and it blew my world because my beliefs about him were shattered in a healthy way. He became much more complex. I found arguments that he was making very similar to arguments that were being made in that moment around Occupy and the whole nine that was going on at that time. And I think what was also fascinating was this revelation for me that white supremacy didn't go anywhere. Just we retired the language. And so it took another 5, 6, 7 years before the country got comfortable again using the term white supremacy, and then us like pulling up examples of it in a historical context that allowed us to go like, wait. We have to reframe how we're even thinking about not just the moment we're in, but how we got here and what the 80s really were and what the 90s really were, right? And that's very uncomfortable for a lot of people.
Thank you, Mike. Rashni, can you share some thoughts?
Hi. Yes, going off of what Mike was talking about as far as our past, I feel that past kind of sits with me as someone who has lived experience in behavioral health institutions. And I've seen my brother and also peers go through really punitive, violent behavioral health systems and youth service systems. And yeah, that history definitely sits on you, both as a worker and as somebody who actually moves through those systems. You feel that history. And so for me, with Deep Space Mind, me and my partner Mel, our intentions with Deep Space Mind is to kind of upend that and try to recreate our own history. I work at a nonprofit agency that serves youth in foster care. I'm also a resource parent. I've done a lot of organizing within and alongside these systems through like the formal channels, and that history, along with what it actually feels like to do that work, has definitely burnt me out. I think for me personally, that channel of work is slowly becoming not accessible to me anymore, just because of my nervous system and the wear that that really puts on people whose bodies have been run through what the behavioral health system, the public behavioral health system looks like for Black and Brown and poor families. So for us, our work is definitely looking at creating parallel systems outside of public systems, and perhaps public systems can look to those, you know, things that we as neighbors and people who are mad and people who are sick or ill, like we know how to survive. Some of us have been youth who've been through grief and been through housing insecurity and been through trauma, and we are here now. And so we do have things that we can share. And if we could create safe structures within our communities to normalize and make it typical culture to, you know, continuously invest in each other, continuously support each other, come up with other systems of economy and other systems of getting what we need that don't require working within a hierarchical nonprofit corporate structure, that don't require carceral systems and surveillance. So that said, a lot of what I've been seeing in the past year, as far as the pandemic and even the uprisings last year, is that us workers on the ground, even us, those who work in large nonprofits, have really worked to push our agencies to be more innovative and be more creative and get online and get digital and be more reactive and more responsive to what workers need and what our youth need. I think we, you know, as the status quo is right now, us workers are really trying to push that. So I think, you know, folks in public systems could really just listen to their workers and listen to their clients and listen to what they need. But the work that actually excites me with Deep Space Mind 215 is really based in a lot of what Leah Lakshmi, who is an organizer who wrote Care Work, talks about. And it's just like listening and lifting up and centering the work of people who are mad in the behavioral health system. I have multiple diagnoses, I'm managing them. And I personally trust people who are mad to give me advice about my mental health and my behavioral health, because they know, they feel the weight of that history, and they can, have that within whatever they're telling me. And so as a mental health co-op, we want to make sure that anyone who joins our co-op and is a member has autonomy over their work and their practice, and are invested in. And along with all the mutual aid and innovative processes that neighbors and community members themselves came up with last year and the year before over the pandemic, they're all creative, and it's us leaning on each other and trying to make those systems legitimate. So I feel like as we see like our community fridges, as we see our reparations work online, as we see, Deep Space Mind was involved in creating Discord, peer support, chat rooms over the pandemic for those of us who are living with, depression or suicide. Like we had a care network created around that, giving money freely to each other without surveillance, without judgment, support groups, things like that. I think just anything that Deep Space Mind sees in our community that we can build and support that is not being supported by large foundations or nonprofits, that's where we see transformation. And maybe public systems can look to some of those as models to transform themselves. But that's where I want to put my energy.
Thank you for that. And so, I mean, a lot of great points already. Like as Sharif pointed out, the need to reimagine is not new, right? And as Akira pointed out, the need to reimagine and the lack of our systems to actually do that has ingrained itself in many structural ways that are really at the fore now, but emblematic of this long history and retrenchment of the state itself. As Mike shared, in many ways, maybe some of the reimagining we're hoping and it's happening is not happening at the scale, right? But fortunately, as Mike said, we have this group of folks in the room talking about that stuff, and people like Rashni, pushing agencies to be more creative, creating safe structures and thinking creatively about that. So I want to ask some questions that really kind of dive into some of the work specifically that you all are doing as people who very much are in this space of reimagining. So for Sharif, in many ways, our education system nationally seems to be in a perpetual state of reimagination, with new curricula, instructional best practices, testing strategies, and progress assessments unveiled every few years. Amidst this constant state of churn, you and your organization, the Center for Black Educator Development, are laser focused on what is often the most consistent and stable part of the system, our teacher workforce, right? Can you talk about why you've chosen to focus on the teacher pipeline as a key lever of systems transformation? And in particular, can you talk about your decision to place racial equity at the very center of your work to combat educational inequity?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. It's like a whole, pot of gumbo of all the different things that are occurring. And, this is and, I think part of the problem is we live in a society that sometimes, forgets historical aspects. We're less likely to learn from other places. We like to admire them, like, oh, look at Finland. But we don't really want to dive in and see what exactly did Finland do. We don't want to look at our own history of when did Black people recently emancipated, how did they go from, less than 5% of literate people to, over 75% literate and during the course of a few decades, right? And so like, how does all of that happen? I think we at the center, we chose racial equity because as Dr. Carter G. Woodson said long ago, there would be no lynching if it weren't for the schoolhouse. And we know that that lynching continues, even though if it's intellectual and cultural and emotionally. And so that's one thing. The other thing, the impact of a teacher, the impact of a principal that's compounded by their influence on the culture and direction and vision for a school is just insurmountable with all the outside things that could happen. And we also understand that while many people think that children are broken and come to school to become whole, we know that many children come to school whole. They leave after many years broken, and their dreams and aspirations, ground to dust. And so for us, this centering a teacher as a leader of the classroom, centering the leadership in the school is absolutely the crucial way to go. We know that for many Black and Brown children, their first experience with policing is with their teacher and principal. It's not actually with the police department. We recognize that children as young as 3 and 4 year olds experience their teachers' racial biases. 3 and 4 years old. And so then when they ask, hey, this 8th grader isn't engaged, that 8th grader may be disconnected for their own self-preservation. And so for us, all of these things are things that carry on day to day and week to week. And we also, so that's one pot, just like what the child's experiences in schools. And then when we also look at research, some as recent as Temple University a few years ago, but it also mirrored the research I saw when I was at the US Department of Ed back in 2013, that most teachers come out of their teacher development program, the teacher prep programs, unprepared to teach, period. Unprepared to teach anybody. And then you layer on that, unprepared to teach students that they may harbor racial biases or actual contempt for. And so what does all of that mean? And so for us, choosing teacher preparation, teacher effectiveness, as well as the racial disparities between students and staff for us was an absolutely crucial aspect of that. We know the impact of education. We know the impact of a well-prepared Black educator on a Black child. And so for us, it was a no-brainer that this is where we were going to dive into deeply. There's no silver bullets, but if I have to choose one, I'm going to choose the dopest teacher and principal that I can find, and I'm going to bet on them.
I like that bet. Akira, turn it to you now. So the COVID pandemic and the resulting impact on employment and economic security and educational stability has laid bare what many activists have been arguing for years, which is that our housing system is fragile, or we could call broken, inequitable, and wholly insufficient to meet the needs of families, especially families of color across the country. So can you talk a little bit more about some of these racist underpinnings in our housing system, the impact of community colors, and particularly impact on communities of color, and particularly then, building off some of your education work, the critical intersection between housing and education that you're seeing?
Yeah, for sure. It's so funny because you can ask this question anytime. There's always a relevant article that relates to this. So recently in Marin County, a family claims that their appraisal of their house went up by $500,000 once they sort of removed themselves, as they said, from the house. So photos, having a white male meet the appraiser, all sort of radically transformed the amount of value they got out of that home. And so thinking, one of the leading Black doctors in the country sort of mentioned, imagine this, the cumulative effect of this over time and space, and how that has enfranchised and segregated our communities and made them very disparate and unequal over time. And of course, just thinking about the central role of housing value and property taxes and school funding and equitable educational outcomes. And so thinking how these sort of processes are both linked to one another, but also reinforcing one another over time and space, and the very critical role of sort of decoupling those systems. And so we are aware of this long history of racism in our school financing and our housing values. So why do we continue to link them? We know these outcomes that Sharif just talked about, we know they are there. So why are we not investing into this pipeline? And so we know the solutions, they're very much right in front of us, but it is the political will and imagination for people to actually implement them that really leaves us sort of in this sort of ongoing predicament. So it's every time we do have a panel, there's an article to point to because this keeps happening. You can look throughout the history of time, Amy's work on Hulk and beyond, the interpersonal things. Again, like Sharif was saying, it is not just these systemic entrenched racism that is impacting these outcomes, but also that interpersonal, the role of the racist teacher and principal, the role of the racist landlord, and how housing manager and sort of creating these, again, very disparate outcomes, things that should be engines of socioeconomic mobility, like housing and schools, become like traps and prisons for people who are not white. So certainly, I think these are things that are like repeating over time, but they are repeating because we are fundamentally like not willing to transform these systems in a way that can actually dismantle them. We just want to keep replicating them.
I think that's really critical, thinking about both the systems and the way the actors, right, are engaging with the systems. We recently published a study showing that households of color were disproportionately likely to experience punitive practices by their owners during the COVID-19 pandemic, regardless of whether they were controlling for whether they were behind on rent relative to white renters, right? And so that, again, is not a function of you didn't pay your rent, right? It's a function of kind of these broader systems and the way that actors are engaging with them and perpetuating inequities that are affecting households. And often, Black mothers and Black mothers with kids are consistently shown to be the most deeply affected by a lot of these realities. So for Mike and Rashni, another emergent theme of the pandemic has been the importance of mental and behavioral health supports, particularly for young people of color who are navigating prolonged social isolation, education disruptions, economic and housing instability, and the fear and trauma of a global health crisis alongside a local gun violence crisis. So Mike, can you give us some background on how the current health and social systems evolved and whether you think they are truly set up to support and center the well-being of communities of color?
So great question. No, I'll start with the latter part. No, I don't think they were set up to support a community of color. They weren't even set up to support poor rural whites, right? I think there's a romanticized version of American history that we're all indoctrinated into, and it's built on what I like to call the mythos of American goodness, etc. I'm going to move fast and then within 3 minutes. So what I want to first do is put out references so that I'm going to talk about things, but I want people to know that there's tons of literature on this. And so a couple of the books I'm pulling from, Medical Apartheid is one. Another is called Illiberal Reformer. Another is called Hitler's American Model. And then I'm also pulling from Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And so I encountered all four of these books in context years after I had already encountered a ton of literature on human development and human ecology and trauma theory and resilience theory and asset-based framing and et cetera. So when I read all this stuff about those four books I named, really do a deep dig into policy, into the underpinnings of what got us to where we're at today, and with a lot of historical analysis, it was a really huge reckoning, like aha moment for me. So how we got here, we have to remember that the American endeavor is one built on economics at a time when economics was not a science, right? Economics did not cross into the American university as a science until the late 1800s. Literally, you're talking like 1885 and after, or like 1880 and after. Before that, economists were historians and they were professors in history departments. But the thing that you have happening at the end of the 1800s into the 1900s, post-Reconstruction, at the time of huge Asian immigration waves and other forms of migration happening domestically, blacks are moving up to the north and are becoming a threat around labor. You have this organization of economic theory matching up with eugenic thought. Eugenics didn't start off racist, but it made the perfect partner for racism and racist thought. Those two things combining then get to the point where on the right and the left, you have this mass proliferation of policy at the state and federal level that is affecting every area in which a person needs, rather, I wouldn't even say, I'll put it as a need. A person needs to create well-being for themselves or their family. So when you think about things like, in a contemporary sense, the way there's this huge conversation around essentially what could be termed as white genocide, right? This conversation about white people being replaced by other people who are non-white and the threats therein, whether it's around jobs, housing, etc., that has its roots in something called race suicide. It is a named theory Sitting presidents, Teddy Roosevelt, talked about this out loud multiple times, shaped policy across multiple levels. You have professors at Yale and at Stanford expounding on these same ideas and again, supporting people and crafting legislation that leads to 30 plus states getting into forced sterilization and linking that to mental and behavioral health. Right? Like the reason we have to sit in the tension of this stuff is because race suicide hasn't gone anywhere. The labeling has shifted a bit, but it hasn't gone anywhere. So the idea, and this is just one example among many, I'll give you one more and I'll stop so you get the point of why I think this history is so important. Between 1914 and 1928, American universities courses that were dedicated to eugenics increased from 44 to 376. So by the time you get to 376 courses on eugenics across American universities, you have 20,000 plus students in 1928 studying eugenics, reading monumental books like Civic Biology. This was not happenstance. It was decades in the making. It was planned, it was organized. And the most insidious part is that it left academia and left policy and crossed into popular culture. So even when we got to the point of saying, well, maybe this isn't good science by the time we get to the 40s, which is when we stopped forced sterilization, the 40s, by that point, Eugene O'Neill, an American playwright, think about The Great Gatsby, this has already infected these thoughts and ideas and theories around pauperism, criminality, deafness, nomadism, and being a vagabond. These ideas of those kinds of traits being hereditary have already poisoned every system and every policy making institution that exists. And so if the conversation wasn't out loud, it was still at many dinner tables. It was still at private parties. And the problem we have, and I'll really end here, the problem we have with policy is we talk about formal policy a lot. Things that are written, legislated, in a handbook, et cetera, whether it's the public sector or the private sector. The real insidious thing is that we have a ton of informal policy, which I like to call culture. Things like not paying women equally. You cannot, it's not written down anywhere, but it's done so often and practiced for so long that the data sets are humongous. And we can, chart trends and the whole nine. So that to me is the history here that we've got to deal with. That's 10 books and 20 years worth of study, but we still got to do it, right, as a group.
That was a lot of really important information, and also we can make sure to share the list of those books with everyone after the call to make sure that everyone can jot them all down and read them themselves. Rashni, I want to build up that and give you an opportunity to react to some of, there were a lot of really important thoughts there, but also frame it in the context of, you're doing a lot of really new and innovative work and thinking in new and innovative ways about the way that we should think about mental health and behavioral health care for people of color. So can you share some thoughts in those contexts?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and thanks, Mike. I think where eugenics meets behavioral health meets racism, I think that's where a lot of those horrors continue into this day. Like, so my brother was in juvenile detention in Los Angeles County in the 90s, and that was when the FBI ended up having to do a probe into the juvenile detention system in Southern California because of the number of suicides amongst Black and brown children there, for instance, or just like the number of, comparing incidents in school that lead to residential placement or out of home placement, compared, the similar behaviors between Black and white children lead to much more punitive measures that lead them into the behavioral health system, the one that I experienced in the 90s and the 2000s through my family and myself, and that all of my peers in my neighborhood experienced. Right now, I'm a mentoring coordinator at Valley Youth House at the AIC, and we do a training for our new mentors, and we talk about how, when unfortunate things happen to people like institutionalization or getting 302'd or something like that, it seems a lot like this individual tragedy. But when you look at the maps of foster care involvement and child removal in Philadelphia, it doesn't really make sense, because if there are families all over, the city, child abuse happens in all of those families. Substance abuse, not all of those families, could happen in all of those families. You know, neglect could happen in all those families. Substance abuse does not discriminate through class. And we know that. We know that substance abuse does not discriminate through class, yet the amount of removal for, you know, middle class and upper middle class families, for white families versus Black families is much lower, which puts those families at risk too, you know, if there are no eyes on those families. So yeah, just thinking about things beyond just like this, you know, now fast forward to 2021 and thinking about how funding flows through these different programs and how people who can't access private mental health need to get their needs met through public systems and, you know, clinics and drop-in centers and things like that. I like to just think about how the money is flowing. It does not flow from people to the people who have the most time spent with people who need those services, or to the people who have experienced these systems and see a lot of things that they could change and have learned a lot in their own journey. Money doesn't flow to those people and invest in those people. It flows to the most well people in the systems, actually, people who didn't have a lot of trauma and were able to go through school pretty smoothly and had some family support and maybe a little bit of wealth to help with school loans and things like that. And so the people who end up at the top of behavioral health systems often are people who are not most affected. They're often not Black, because especially with the with being Black in the public mental health system, there's a much closer relationship to prisons and carceral systems. And so it's easy to get sucked into those systems where you're confined and you don't have power or the ability to be invested in or become a leader in behavioral health or mental health. And so all that said, I think as a worker, and I've been a direct care worker before I had my master's for 7 or 8 years. Since I was 19 years old, I was a direct service worker in agencies in Philadelphia. And as an hourly worker with no degree, you spend the most time with the clients, and those workers tend to have the most similar lived experiences as the clients or the consumers of services, and yet have the least say in court, the least say as far as institutional development, structural development, the least say as far as funding, where we look for funding, and yet have the most burden on their nervous system and the least pay, on the most burden on childcare and their own families. And so it just perpetuates a system where the people who do make the decisions are the ones whose nervous systems are intact, because they haven't been taxed by the work, they haven't been taxed by their own experience, and they don't feel that history in the systems that they're administrating. And so they can make decisions that don't actually line up with what communities are actually asking for. Yeah, so as far as Deep Space Mind, as a co-op, our mission is to make sure that we bring in as many people with lived experience as possible and get them the skills to self-determine their own futures. And that is from an Afrofuturist perspective, but yeah, so that, you know, it's not diagnoses and psychiatrists and, you know, professionals who have never been through what we've been through telling us what our future is going to be and what the future of our neighborhoods are going to be. And, you know, zoning out our playgrounds and our green spaces, because that's going to be where the well people and the rich people are going to live. And you don't have a place to live because you're not well enough to be stable and, you know, to have your kids be quiet on the train or whatever it is. So anything we could do or support to that is outside of those systems. I mentioned some of them. We also participated in community-led research. We were part of the Philly Renters Wellness Survey that ended up being a report published by CLS. We like to partner intentionally with youth to do intentional intergenerational work and organizing. We have worked with the Young Artist Program, with CRY, the Creative Resilience Youth Program. Both of those young people we have helped them develop skills and leadership to roll out their own mutual aid initiatives so that they can get CRY definitely created a fund so that other youth in Philadelphia who don't have access to private mental health care could access therapy. And in my opinion, I feel like that's a much more quicker, effective way to get youth mental health care than having them be on a waiting list at, I'm not going to name any agencies, but at, you know, some of our public agencies where getting an evaluation so you can get housing is going to take a certain amount of time. Getting services, early intervention services. Like I said, I'm a resource parent to a young child. Getting early intervention services, getting childcare through the public system is untenable. I have to go to my community to get things that I need. And that includes shoes, childcare, whatever it is. And so the more that we can create that and create that as a culture versus, going to these large corporations that are faceless and, don't live where we live and don't know what we know. That's where I see energy being really efficient right now in Philadelphia.
Thank you. And it's a really wonderful segue to kind of our next question, which is moving away from the perpetuation, like you were saying, of the systems, right? And kind of pushing towards new models and new ideas, right? And so in the fields of criminal justice, child welfare, and immigration, the debate about reimagining public systems often revolves around whether to reform them from the inside or inside out, or to abolish and dismantle them entirely. The narrative in education, housing, and healthcare systems, however, is often somewhat different and can often be more restrained one, right? So from various vantage points, should these existing systems were dismantled, how would new frameworks operate differently? In other words, can you share what reimagining actually looks like and how this can be operationalized? And this is something that's open to the whole panel. So whoever wants to go first, jump in.
This is just on the top of my mind right now, but the treatment of workers in care work is really, really important. Like I said, there needs to be a pathway for folks who are most interested and most invested in this work, and that is usually people who've been through it or have been adjacent to it, can be supported in entering into care work so that they can take care of their community and have the resources to do so. Right now, I think a lot of social services are gatekeeping care work and making it so that it's lopsided towards people who were able to complete the certification rather than people who are going to be most invested in their communities and not take this experience on this group of people and move to somewhere where it's, it pays more, it's not in the community, or it's in their community of origin, and it's more comfortable and safe there. Right now, I think Philadelphia is being used as a petri dish by a lot of students. People get to practice on our youth and practice on folks who have mental health problems in this city, and then go leave and take those resources and that knowledge somewhere else. So as much as we can invest in our workers, in those of us who have lived experience, as much as we can invest in youth and neighbors who are already doing the things to promote wellness. I have a neighbor who cleans up 5 square blocks of my neighborhood with no compensation. He doesn't have a smartphone, so he can't get on the app Glitter that was created by a former sanitation worker who similarly worked for a public system and couldn't deal with the inefficiency, and so just created his own app. And looking at what are we already doing, Black people already create our own wellness every day. We don't just sit around like flailing and shooting each other and not raising our kids and just sitting in our houses, not doing anything and not working and not promoting wellness. We work to create wellness for ourselves and joy for ourselves every day in resilient and creative ways. But folks who have wealth don't necessarily see that and want to put their own ideas into what wellness is for us. And often that's centered on a Western conception of what wellness is, and that is like no symptoms. And for me, as someone living with PTSD and talking about all these histories and the histories I carry in my body, I'm very grateful to my PTSD for making me remember the things that my brother and I and my mother have gone through, because I won't forget, what these institutions have done to us. And I won't be, lulled into this idea that like, it's going to be nice, it's going to be cozy, we're going to reform things and it's going to be good, because of the roots that Mike just mentioned. I've felt them, I've seen them. They're still here. They're here right now in 2021, and they are in how we treat our young people and how we treat folks who are in institutions in Philadelphia.
Thank you, Rashni. Anyone else want to offer some thoughts on that?
I'll just say that I think part of, restructure. Well, first of all, people are most comfortable eating around the edges. I remember my mother giving us hot cereal all winter long, and I hated it. It was from oatmeal to cream of wheat to wheatine to oatmeal, right? Like, oh, that's going to keep you warm. I'm like, it's too hot to eat. I much preferred cereal. And she would say, eat around the edges. And that would take me forever. I'm like literally going around the edge with a little spoonful. And I think that's often how we try to reimagine, despite the dire need for urgent change, or even just a vision. Because most of these things aren't going to happen overnight, but what does it look like 15 years from now? What do we want? That kid that's entering kindergarten right now, what promises can we deliver that will ensure that their aspirations are met, that they leave feeling respected and whole? And this is something that we know will, like, everybody's talking about, oh, we want to be the economic engine. Philly wants to be the economic engine of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania wants to be the economic engine of the East Coast. Like, but you incarcerate our children, you push them out of school, they leave illiterate, they leave disenfranchised, yet we want to continue to talk about this prosperous. Huey Newton a long time ago said that, we flaunt all these things, this American dream, in front of children who basically are disenfranchised from the early on. And so we like wave it in front of them like, hey, here's what you can aspire to. But society is going to basically say, you're on your own. And children get the message that, you know what, they only deserve the education that parents can afford. They deserve the safety nets that their parents can afford. And so our system overall, Mike talked about like the history of how this country was founded and where power and decision making was constructed and protected. And where's the line of demarcation where that ended? Like, where exactly did that end? People might want to say, oh, the Civil War, oh, 1954, oh, the civil rights, but like, yeah, but did it really? And so I think that's a part of it, like understanding history. And you got this whole, hysterical anti, teaching truth and teaching accurate history going on, on the side we haven't really spoken about, but that's going on, which is, the same thing that, those are the things that used to lead, these mobs that included children, to lynch and burn Black people, right? It's the same anger and backlash. And so when we look at the institutions and how they're built, how they're protected, how adult-centric they are, how specific adults are central to it going on. I think first, before we even start talking about the reconstruction of things, and I agree with you, education is one of those things like people are like, oh no, don't do that. Oh, don't do that. Oh no, well, not that. Oh no. Just like, how exactly are we going to come about change? Because nothing is, everything is sacred, every single thing. Despite people can say like, oh, these weren't created. Which schools were created with the well-being of Black children in mind? Which ones? And then replicate that, because most of them, when they were created and then constructed, Black folks weren't even thought about. And so if we think about, suppose we had a situation where every policymaker, every politician, every person of civic leader or whatever that had these powers to make big decisions, suppose they had to put their kids in the worst school in their district. Then would we start thinking about what's sacred and what needed to change? Imagine across the country if instead of 80% of the teachers being white, suppose 80% of the teachers were middle-class Black women and the students were mostly white. We'd see a January 6th every day, right? Because there's some, they wouldn't stand for these outcomes for, their children, being pushed out. And so until our children are looked at as full human beings, full citizens in these cities and communities and in this country, we're going to continue to have problems. Like right now, we've built schools to keep white folks from moving out of the city, but we can't think about building schools to keep Black kids from dying. That's where we are right now in this city and in this country. And so for me, like what it means to be, to think radically, I think a part of it is, there has to be this centering. And Rashni talked about this, everybody talked about it, but like, when Brian Anderson talks about proximity, proximal, being who's closest, who actually knows the problem, who actually experienced the problem. They're the ones that can tell you. I've been invited all around the country, And there are people who have the power and they invite me and they're like, oh, we'll fly you in. We want to show you what we're doing. I'm like, okay, I'm skeptical, but yeah, let's see it. And what they'll do is first I'll be in this fancy office and none of the people will look like, or very few, there'll be a couple of folks who look like, the people in the communities that they say they're solving for. But then they'll take me to the community like, oh, you got to meet Mrs. So-and-so. She's amazing. She does this, she does that. And so they take me typically to this Black woman and she knows the problem. She knows the solution. She knows this. And guess what? She ain't even on payroll. She ain't even on payroll. But she's the one doing all this work. She's the one that knows these communities. She's the one the community responds to, right? And when they need it, they'll say like, hey, can you bring everybody? We'll give you T-shirts and some chicken and pizza. Can you get all the parents to come in and wait a minute, were parents at the table when you decided to go that route, or no? You just want them to show up and endorse. And so not only are the people tokenized, but even their ideas and experiences are tokenized. And they are so far removed from the actual table of decision making. And I think that's one thing, to just start off and like shaking things up. Bring the people that you typically want to show around and show like, oh, they're the ones with the deepest connections. They're the ones that should have the voice, and not just the voice just to say, oh, I heard them, but the actual influence. Because you know what, for me as an educator, when I was a teacher, it wasn't just the idea of teaching. I looked at teaching as Dr. Martin Ryder, a district veteran, said that teaching Black children well is the purest form of activism, and that you can't separate educational justice and racial justice. And so for me, I was all in, right? And so those people, and the reason why, because for me, it was a life and death situation. It wasn't just a job. I wasn't just saying like, oh, this is something that I want to do. This was an absolute life and death situation. The way Rashni talked about her brother, that's how I felt about my children, my neighbor's children, my relatives. Like, I have to get this right. We have to get it right, because it is absolutely conditional for us to continue to survive as a people. Those are the people with that level of urgency and focus and experience is who we have to center. And unfortunately, many people, once they get in position of power, they're able to develop the safety nets or avoid the system as a whole. And I can't help, and the last thing I'll say is I can't help but to think about when public education was first initially starting, people with means, they said, why would I be involved? Why would I put my children in a public school? That's like me going to a public bathroom, and I would never do it.
Just very quickly, if I could say that I agree with everything that's been said so far. But another thing that I've realized over the course of history is when we do center people who have done things at the grassroots level, we tend to give them like grassroots budgets. You're like, oh, okay, you figured this out on $1, so like, bye, and like walk away. And so like you also need to fund in perpetuity like these transformative ideas with transformative budgets. Like you cannot just say you did this on nothing and like no sleep and no care and nothing like that. So you can do it again in perpetuity. We'll take advantage of that. It is that sort of extractive logic that creates like this sort of perpetuation of like profit-driven logics, and people literally cannot survive doing the work that needs to be done. They start to chase grants and try to make profit-making entities in ways that allow you to stray from the mission. So just wanted to flag that.
This is fantastic. I have to throw one thing in, just building on what Akira said directly. If you cannot map your value statements and DEI statements and REI statements, REI being racial equity and inclusion, DEI being diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? If you can't map those statements to direct line items in your budget, like then we don't really have anything. We've got thoughts, we've got thought experiments, thought leadership, but thought leadership isn't saving Black children. It's not saving poor rural white children, right? It's not saving the migrant children. It's not saving anybody. Our thoughts matter in so much as they promote some kind of change in behavior, which can be a change in spending and allocation, which is wholly necessary. The political economy is the root of everything we're talking about today. We have to name it. We have to name that human well-being is now a construct of political economy and has been weaponized against many, many, many people. So for me, the reframing of the issues starts the journey of either reform or complete and total abolition and reimagining of that thing top to bottom. And sometimes it's a mix of both at the same time, to be very honest, because the situation's that dire. When we start to think about the fact that we spend, there's a lot of compulsory spending in public systems. How many billions and now trillions of dollars have gone to the poisoning of the central nervous system of developing brains and bodies? We have all the literature in trauma and human development. We got Sandy Bloom locally. I mean, we got all the stuff here to talk about trauma and human development and systems, et cetera. Now we need to start doing real financial analysis around what that means. And what does it mean when we're complacent? What does it mean when we're reticent and scared, right? There are other risks besides financial risk. Talking from the corporate end, the foundation end, et cetera, and I'm saying this as a board member of a foundation, a proud board member of the Fells Fund now for 3 years, and on their investment committee, as someone who raises funds, as someone that advises private social impact investment funds. Like, the reality is here, and we have to talk about it. Money is not in some third, space category that sits by itself and has no bearings on what we're talking about as it relates to well-being. So in the space of compulsory spending, not even just the discretionary stuff that foundations do, but in the space of compulsory spending, criminal justice, juvenile justice, social services, public education. I mean, we're talking about huge budgets, lots of zeros, and the outcomes, we have to ask lots of questions. And again, the sense-making journey, I look at this and go, we are spending trillions of dollars on poisoning the central nervous system of developing brains and bodies. That is the outcome I see over the last 20 years of doing this kind of work. That's not an indictment of anybody. I'll say this last piece here. When we want to reimagine systems, we have to depersonalize. I'm only 37, so 36 turning 37. I've been doing this work for a very long time. Prior to being 18, I was involved in this work. But that does not mean the root of the problem sits with me. There's a lot of issue around depersonalization locally and nationally that gets in the way. It centers individuals and feelings as opposed to the core of the problem being structural, being systems based, right? We get lost, we can't do systems analysis because we get lost in personal feelings and people needing to feel good. And I think that's a huge complication. Again, not just Philly, it's across the country. And it's a huge thing we got to talk about.
So thank you. This is, I mean, there's so much here. And to take Sharif's analogy, while policy might just be eating around the edges, we clearly are not here. And there's a lot more we can unpack. I want to turn to the Q&A from the audience. We have a question in here ready. Please feel free, everyone, to drop some additional questions in the Q&A. For the next 20 minutes, we'll be entertaining that. I might add in some additional questions. Panelists could ask each other questions as well. This is just like everyone here on their own. I wish I could spend many, many hours with. So to our first question that came in, how do we actually reimagine and reallocate the money spent on incarcerating children so that it goes to community programs that understand and truly work with the individual child and address the individual strengths, trauma the child may have faced, and any housing, mental health, or educational needs?
You have to see a person as a whole human being first to even get to that analysis, right? So from a systems perspective, I use the health sciences model of human development to talk to folks on that end, right? So that the health sciences model of human development says that humans develop in 4 core dimensions at the same time. They're co-occurring and they're dynamic. They're influencing one another. So that's the biological, the psychological, the social, and the 4th dimension being spiritual, which is really about meaning making, not religion. You heard me talk a bit about meaning making already. If you start with a framework like that to then ask other questions, right? You got to also practice curiosity, because there's this thing that we do with young people. We start at the moment of some quote unquote offense or infraction as if that's the genesis of the issue at large and at hand. And then we do everything else from there. We iterate solutions from there, et cetera. And so I was in a one-to-one interview for a project that I'm working on around reimagining the juvenile justice system. It's really an abolition-based project with the juvenile justice system. It's called Care Not Control. It's a campaign headquartered out of the Village of Arts and Humanities as like the fiscal backbone, but it's a coalition of a number of orgs, including YAS, the Youth Arts Self-Empowerment Project, YSRP, the Youth Sentencing and Reentry Project. There's a number of partners at the table working on this. But in this interview with a former juvenile lifer, actually, who now does a ton of work with young people, trying to get them out of this trajectory of harm, this young man in the group was talking about wanting to be rich and make a lot of money. And so this gentleman asked him, he said, tell me what that looks like for you. Because the guy was like, I knew where this was going and I needed to expose him to something. And that young man said, yo, rich, I'd be able to eat every day. I'd be able to have meals whenever I wanted every day. His right to be satiated is what he calls being rich. We are so paradigmatically far from understanding what it means to support human well-being, and that when we task a system that was not birthed for the well-being of people to begin with, let alone Black and brown people, like a criminal justice system, when we task them with the care and well-being of Black and brown people, when we're 90 steps away from being anywhere close to being right. So how we get to that point, that in terms of like moving money, etc., you gotta have some kind of framework that allows for the centering of the full humanity of the people in the system to be the core organizing principle. You gotta have some buckets by which you can then think about allocations and resources, outcomes, evaluations, etc., because we live in an overly bureaucratic society. And whether or not I like that, that's the chessboard and where the fight is. So that I think is a starting place. But you got to enumerate the harms and the risk. And you can do that in those 4 categories in a way that the current amalgamation of the justice system doesn't allow us. But it's not going to, that centering Black people and wellness and our full humanity in those categories, enumerating the risk of the system itself on those 4 core dimensions of development, that's not something that the justice system is going to do for itself to hold itself accountable. It's going to have to come outside with a lot of pressure and a lot of thought around, here's what we could be doing differently to address those core buckets of human development.
I would just like hop on and say that you should just like give the money to the people. Like you're saying, like, it's just kind of like, I don't know, like we could figure out programs and match and evaluate and all of that stuff. But like, again, if people just had money to buy food and to get housing, we've seen what this child tax credit has done. It's like very bizarre to me that this is not like plastered on everything, that like child poverty and hunger and vulnerability is decreasing because we're giving people money directly every month. And yeah, that works. So why don't we like stop tying it to inflation and irrational fears that are most likely tied to, you know, CEOs and university endowments like doubling their wealth in the last year, and tie it to the reality that we need to decarcerate, abolish, and redistribute in ways that get that like harmful money into people's hands so that they can spend it the way that they need to.
I think engaging those young people in the work to transform the system as much as possible. It's not, you know, always feasible all the time, but, you know, connecting young people with the Care Not Control Coalition, with the folks at the Village of Arts and Humanities, with YASP and their youth hubs, their juvenile justice hubs. As much as you can put them in community with people who, if you may not know what you need to do, but there are people in the community who do. And if you can look for those people and build trust with them and understand where the theories they're working from, the framework they're working out of, then maybe you can build your own network of change that you can funnel people that you love and care for through that. Versus like, you know, it's not, if you like doing the work doesn't mean like you pull up a resource list. I know people always want to have a resource list. If only we had a resource list, then everyone would know exactly where to go. It's that resource list. We just don't know what the resources are. Sometimes you have to be in a community, you have to get to know people. You need to, especially in Philly, if you want to know what really works, you have to actually talk to people about what's really working, because it might not be the mental health agency on the corner. It might be the boxing gym on the corner that is the hub of mental health for Black males in the area. And so how will you know that if we're just online, if we're just like asking other behavioral health administrators who don't live in the city? Like, you have to find some trust in yourself, trust that you can get to know people, and trust that people who you don't necessarily think will be the experts might actually teach you something. And that includes young people themselves. Yet those young people might have peers who are already connected to Juveniles for Justice or Valley Youth House Pride Task Force or any number of these youth leadership organizations that are doing a lot to reimagine the world, because they have to. It's life and death for them, to have a reality that they could actually live and succeed in.
Sharif, do you want to offer any thoughts before I jump on to the next question?
I mean, I agree with everything, and I would just, double click on Rashni, centering youth. Just like those Black women I would meet that were like, just doing an amazing job and unpaid or underpaid, as Akira pointed out, like those kind of budgets, and actually like, say, what, this is humanity, is life and death. It is worth, actually funding, like life and death. I don't even think we're at that point that everyone's, I don't think everybody's life is of equal value. I don't think everybody's death is of, equal weight. And until we get there, the mindset feeds everything. But I think if anything, centering the youth and solving the problem. Chief Seattle used to say, children don't inherit their earth from us, we borrow it from them. So imagine if we, interacted with it with that level of weightiness, and which means if we're borrowing it from them, we can't solve anything without them.
It's a great point, and I think the conversation here seems to be pushing everyone's thoughts about who not just to engage in the process, but who to fund and support. And so there's a direct question that's coming in. I think that's more about kind of operationalizing this idea, right? And so one of the attendees asked, how do we show up for folks who are so close in proximity to the issues and the ones that are most invested, who are working and trying to attain the credentials needed to do this work well? And how do we get philanthropists and organizations to directly support this?
So I feel like right now, Philadelphia's, I'll say at least the youth service system is operating on a prayer for empathy, and like, operating on hoping that their employees who do invest very much in their youth and the people that they serve will have a high level of empathy and guilt and shame, and won't ask for more and won't leave because that's messed up, and they want to keep their clients and they want to keep their youth. And I think the current public system is operating on a prayer that fragile system of love, basically like Black love, solidarity amongst poor people, solidarity, between direct workers and clients, will last. And, as a worker myself, my nervous system and my credit score is like really, 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 really struggling, under the work that, we have to do. And so this is not the most I feel like it's a reimagining public systems also means giving workers, the most lowest paid workers, a new sense that they have somewhere to go economically for their own, like as far as their own stability, their own wealth, that their well-being is cared for. And that might sound like, whoa, what, most corporations do that now. Well, in like local agencies in Philadelphia, that is a reimagining that we as workers who care a lot are worth more, that my mental health, pay can get reimbursed through my health care. I paid $4,000 out of pocket last year. I got $40 in reimbursement through my health insurance. So, just like basic stuff like that, basic, consideration, basic respect towards and I'm not the lowest paid worker. Please don't think that that's what I'm saying, but I'm a regular worker. So like I'm in the middle there. So, I'm definitely speaking on behalf of folks who are youth, youth who are trying to enter into youth services and are leaders themselves and are trying to get their first full-time work, at our agency or other agencies that are similar. I just feel like it shouldn't be hoops to jump through. They shouldn't have to be the perfect person with lived experience, the perfect worker, because there are plenty of workers who are not perfect, who don't have lived experience, who get all of the chances and all the investment and all of the support. And part of it is because they have the nervous system to put up with a lot of the stuff that a nonprofit will throw at you as a worker. And so just like treating all of your workers as full human beings who have needs beyond just fulfilling the task and getting your grant numbers filled. Some of us want to be parents. Some of us want to be resource parents. Some of us want to start our own nonprofits or be a leader or be a supervisor one day. Or some of us really want to just work our current job really well, which is something that I also feel. And we don't really want always to be pushed into like leadership, because some of us feel like we're leaders in the community where we are. So just literally just paying public system workers who are working in contracted agencies, especially in small nonprofits and things like that, small programs, paying them a living wage. The median income in Philadelphia, I think, is around 60,000 right now. And we as social workers are kind of being trained to be grateful for much less than that. Like, you should be grateful for just having a salary. You could be a direct worker. You should be grateful for just having benefits. You could be an hourly worker, and pitting us against each other wage-wise versus creating an environment where everyone, can strive for what they're striving for and can be a leader in the position that they're in no matter what. And that, as like youth serving agencies in particular are looking to former clients and people who've been through their institution as far as an employment pool, because those people can see what critical changes need to happen. And that's also an enthusiastic, urgent pool versus sort of like, this is almost a hobby because I don't need to be doing this work. If I'm not paid well, I'm still gonna eat. I'm still gonna have all the things that I need because I could ask other people for those things. Not all of us have that luxury. And for some of us, the burden of our education or certification really, really, really weighs with us. It how I got to my position and how other people have gotten to their position with a master's degree has been very different. And the burden of that economic history on how I do my job is with me, and I have to manage that. So just thinking about that when you think about your employees and investing in their education, and what living under debt does to a worker, and the implicit biases that administrators put against their workers as far as when we ask for things, being judged as not being frugal or not being responsible or not being enough of a leader to deserve a living wage. So to me, it's very boring, but that would be a reimagining of public systems, just being treated like a human being whose work matters and is valuable and brings in agencies millions and millions and millions of dollars. So, yeah.
And I would just quickly add, when I was a principal and I would support other principals, I used to say, you can't lead the school from your office. You can't lead it from Excel sheets and PowerPoints, and many felt that's where they felt most comfortable. And that's where, they had that, several folks have talked about not having that lived experience, not having that racial stress and trauma and those kind of things. And so they ended up put in these positions of decision-making and power. They grew up far away from the situations, the problems that they want to solve from. They often didn't attend the type of schools, they attended very different schools. And now they're in a position of oh, now I'm trying to change this experience. But imagine if they are tone deaf, if they're not engaging, they're ignoring people who are actually yeah, you know what, not only as a Black staff, am I saying that policy is oppressive? That policy was in place when I was a student. So when I'm talking about not having police, in schools, is because as a 10th grader at Overbrook High School, I remember, being gripped up by a police officer. At that time, they were actually Philadelphia police officers in schools. And so I can tell you what that felt like, why I reacted the way that I did, how I felt about being in trouble, about my reaction, all of those things. I'm saying it from a lived experience, or I'm saying it from my child or a neighbor or a friend, or when my brother got and his friends got smashed in the head with a billy club outside of the school because they didn't walk fast enough by a police officer. Like, I can tell you, this is what was going on at that moment, and this is why I have a visceral reaction, and I have ideas about like how this can be addressed, how students can be made safe. When I wrote an open letter to the Philadelphia Police Department as a principal, I was saying like those are the things that I was responding to, and then I'm seeing how you're treating my middle school students. Like, no, it's a problem, right? And so imagine if I didn't have any of those experiences, and I'm also not listening. And I'm like, well, this is my PowerPoint, this is what I think, and this is in my bubble of folks who pontificate, here's what we think. And again, it means that I'm belittling or dismissive of your experiences. You're not the leader in your space, when actually those folks are. And so I think as much as possible doing that. And I think it's leadership, like how are leaders developed? Mike has talked about several ways that leadership development. And I'm thinking even as principal certification and development, I'm like, most of the stuff needs to be excavated and actual real stuff needs to be put into their leadership development programming, like that, like real things about how to serve communities, how to lead with humility, how to be respectful, how to be listeners, how to be engaging. All of that needs to be actual, like how we develop leaders and who we look at as leaders.
So I want to take this opportunity to pose one last question before we wrap things up, because I think this is a nice, interesting contrast to a lot of or complement to a lot of stuff we're talking about. We've been having a very kind of person-centered conversation and investing in people in many ways, right? And there was a question that came up about, thinking about place-based investments, right? How do we, what do you think about place-based funding, grant making, focusing on a particular neighborhood and concentrating donations in one place in that way?
I think it's actually very smart. I think, so there are two core frames that I think mess a lot of things up when it comes to anything, and place-based is no different. I think place-based it allows us to simplify a little bit of the complexity. There's two core frames I'll explain really quickly. One is on time and time economy. Time is an investment. The more power and privilege you have, the more you have time as an asset. And the more you actually understand time as an asset to protect. That's been a fascinating thing as my career has shifted, the amount of people that talk to me about time as an asset that are older than me and that are giving me some wisdom, right, around how to organize for the business and blah, blah, blah. It's been interesting because as someone who grew up dirt dumb poor, like, time is just not a thing. Everything is so and what I mean by by everything is so last, it feels like everything can be ripped out from underneath you in 2 seconds. You feel like everything's a zero-sum game. One mistake ruins your life. Like, it's a very, very interesting way that time as an asset is framed when you're poor and socialized for you when you're poor versus when you have more power and privilege. So time, short-term, medium-term, and long-term, anytime we talk about gun violence, I tend to have to take two steps back and go, wait. We have just talked about 3 different categories of outcomes in 2 minutes, and they're all sloshing around, and we're trying to make sense of a thing, but like, you can't even wrap your mind around what thing to what scale of time makes sense for whom and when, right? And if you can't, like, that's a huge thing. So being place-based is a simpler way to be thinking about short, medium, and long-term outcomes, investments, etc., things you're looking for, because you can actually build deeper and better relationships with an ecosystem, if you will. And humans, like, social ecological theory is real. We are embedded in systems that are within systems that are within systems. Neighborhoods are their own system that have systems within systems there. Some of it's compulsory, like a school, got healthcare. So like, being place-based just allows for some of that complexity to at least have a center of gravity, again, to think about time economy and investment of time as a thing matched to money, etc. The only other frame I'll offer up that place-based I think could help people think about in a contextual sense again, lessening some of the complexity that people will use as an excuse, I think, to drive away, like, oh, well, forget it, we can't. A lot of people want to, and this goes back to that example I gave of that young man who was like, being rich means I can have meals every day, right? People are talking to Black and brown and migrant folks and folks living in abject poverty. That is not just about a lack of finances. There's so many other things that happen at the psychological and spiritual, like the meaning making level, to how you think about life and see life, right, etc. When you come to groups of people that are used to surviving, doesn't mean they don't have joy. All of that is real. I agree with that a lot, totally. But when you come to people that are used to surviving as the sense of homeostasis, and they're then like, what do you need to thrive? You might get questions that better answer, what do you need to be stabilized? And then we can get to these conversations around thriving. And what I'm finding in the work that, again, being place-based can make a little simpler is that people don't understand that arc and that stabilization is a huge thing, because even $15 an hour is not going to help you fully stabilize, right? Like you still need more income than that, right? So that's my thought about place-based from the end of like why I think it's actually good for funders to be traveling that way, to partner with ecosystems and folks to reimagine, but you need some constraints to help you think about things that you don't even know you're kind of sloshing around and messing up sometimes.
So I think I want to hear everyone's answer to this, but unfortunately we're approaching on time. So if anyone wants to give one last 15-second blurb, no? Okay, cool. Well, I mean, I don't know if you saw it in the comments, but Rashni, you got an amen. And I know there was a lot of people really, snapping their fingers, clapping their hands, nodding their heads, and really just, there was so much content here in what you all said. And I just could talk to you all endlessly. And it shows really the importance and need to have these conversations about reimagining and keep having these conversations and make sure it's not just us in this room having this conversation, right? Pushing systems more broadly to do that. So with that said, thank you all. And I'm going to turn it over to Marie Williams, who's Deputy Director of the Stoneleigh Foundation, to close us out.
Thank you, Vincent. As Vincent said, I'm Marie Williams, Deputy Director of the Stoneleigh Foundation. And I first want to say, I totally understand no one taking up the offer to use 15 seconds to add to this conversation. It feels as though every single issue that was raised merited a lot more time than we had. But on behalf of the Stoneleigh Foundation staff, the board of directors, I'd first like to thank our fantastic lineup of panelists, Akira, Rashni, Sharif, and Mike, for sharing your expertise and a powerful new vision for our public systems. I want to thank you, of course, Vincent, for your stellar moderation of today's discussion. We're honored to count you among our Stoneleigh Fellows, and we're so proud of your groundbreaking and nationally recognized work to develop more equitable housing policy. And of course, we'd like to thank you in the audience for tuning in to our Reimagining Public Systems event series. We hope you found these discussions illuminating and relevant for your own systems change work. As a reminder, in concert with this series, we're currently seeking letters of inquiry for fellowship projects 1 to 3 years in duration that offer a broad reimagining of how public systems might better serve youth, families, and communities of color. In particular, we're seeking project ideas that place racial equity at the very center of systems transformation. Letters of inquiry are due by December 15th. Please visit stoneleigfoundation.org/reimagining to learn more. With that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today and have a great afternoon.